Hey guys, and welcome to Mastering V-Ray Lesson 11. We're nearly at the finish line now, and because I couldn't get the lesson out before New Year's, I haven't had a chance to thank you for everything you guys did for my brother and I last year. Now, to say you changed our lives would be a pretty big understatement. We're still, well, even on New Year's, we're still having a bit of trouble kind of believing what even happened this year. So to be able to put so much focus on my boxing has finally given my life fulfillment. And in exchange for that, I really hope these lessons continue to help you out in a similar way. So at this point, the work in progress I've seen from heaps of you guys is just ridiculous. I mean, there's been artists out there who even taken what I've taught and kind of brought it to a new level, and whether that's creating new materials or even just releasing those innovating scripts that provided the same functionality that us 3ds Max guys have for you Maya and Cinema 4D artists. Now, also remember that as soon as I finish this lesson, we're going to start organizing the pre-sale for Mastering Lighting, and that will go up pretty soon. So after Mastering V-Ray finishes and I've completed that finale lesson, I'll be taking a short break with my brother to go on a holiday, kind of clear our minds so I can return with a bit of focus put purely onto those new lessons. So just to give you a little brief rundown, Mastering Lighting is going to run with the exact same format as Mastering V-Ray, in that the lessons will be released roughly every month and they'll run for about 1 to 3 hours, breaking down how different scenes are constructed and lit using my own lighting theories and those of photographers I've worked with. So my experience in the print industry has given me a very versatile knowledge on how photographers work and how to, more importantly, translate that photography knowledge into CGI, which is why my work is usually pretty photorealistic. You know, I had a lot of experience one-on-one at Light Farm with Matt Blamires and on just countless print jobs, you know, getting a feel for how different photographers work and kind of paint their scenes with light. So it's going to utilize all the knowledge taught in Mastering V-Ray, but because I've already explained in this course kind of how, well, in this course I've explained everything that I would use in a print production workflow in detail. So when it comes to the lighting side of things, I can put pure focus on that and know that I don't have to go in and explain how the materials were constructed, and instead I can focus on how to get those materials looking as good as possible. Also, it's important to realize that in that course, I'm not going to be sticking to one piece of software or lighting style. I'm going to try and encompass kind of my entire folio of work inside that course. So whether it be doing photorealistic work or hyper-realistic work or even cartoony work, I'll try and fit all of that in. And on top of that, I'm going to utilize all the software that I actually did use in my print production workflow. So it'll include things like Octane Render, V-Ray. There'll even be a little bit of a ZBrush to go in and adding detail on some of the meshes, showing you just little different tricks, you know, that I utilized throughout the course. So it's not going to be sticking to one piece of software. And that's not to say that you can't, just like in the V-Ray course, you can't translate that to other pieces of software. Like, you should be able to, once again, use Maya and Cinema 4D, but the scene files will mostly be 3ds Max and Octane. So with that being said, let's get back on topic and I'll jump into lesson 11. So in order to demonstrate the criticalness of the GGX BRDF, I first need to trace through the evolution of how people used to make materials. So when people originally started creating materials with V-Ray, they were very limited because essentially you were stuck with using either the Blinn and Ward BRDF. This microfacet GGX wasn't there. That's for the guys who are potentially joining the course late or who are just recently getting into V-Ray. So the problem with that is you're not getting that effect happening that I'm demonstrating in lesson 2 with the Wacom tablet, where from angles you're starting to see the reflection glossiness change. So I noticed that pretty early on, about 1.5 years ago, and that's when I started to really enhance my materials by creating that multi-layered approach. However, the problem was with that approach is I wasn't blending the glossiness based on the viewing angle. I was simply blending two materials at kind of 50%. So if you see here, I didn't have the fall off mapping. I just kind of pushed this up to 80% or whatever to get that little bit of a sharp coating on. Because a lot of product shots in the print industry require things to look really glossy, and to get that hyper real look, that's basically what's essential. So over time, I narrowed how to get that look down, and that's where this multi-layered approach was developed that's been key throughout this entire course. However, the major problem with doing that, as you know, is that when you have the extra materials layered into the V-Ray blend material, V-Ray doesn't sample that as one single material. It's sampling both of those completely separate, and so the render times were massive. So now you can imagine that in the lesson 4, when I was creating those advanced materials, where we've got a blend material with 4 different layers, simply to change the way the reflections are working, was completely slow. And it was the cause for a lot of late nights working in the industry, where I simply just had to kind of let it happen, because at the end of the day, the client wants that quality, but there was no other way to do it. So that's why I was pushing for the GGX to be developed. So from there on the course, there were a couple of people who mentioned the question to me about why can't you use a reflection, a fall-off map in the reflection glossiness of the material to map it so that towards the edge you're changing the glossiness that way. And the answer to that question is it's not physically correct. That's not what's happening in the real world. So if I bring up this material here, this is just a simple V-Ray material with one layer with a blend as the BRDF. And you can see towards the edges we've got the same glossiness of 0.8. So even though the highlight's spreading towards the edge, that's not changing. Then from there I developed this multi-layered approach, and now you can see that there's 2 different materials creating that halo effect, and it looks pretty good, but then things got slow. So that's where this next question came in: why can't we use a fall-off map in the reflection glossiness slot? And you can see here, if I just pull this down just to demonstrate this effect a little bit more, towards the edge we're going more sharp, and front on we're more blurry. But as you can see, compared to this example on the right here, it's not the same effect. You're not getting that nice halo effect. If you look at that lesson number 2 and look at the Wacom tablet, you can very specifically see, even at an angle of about 80%, that we're getting this effect happening, where you're seeing the sharp reflections from the screen, but also the blurry reflections. Whereas in this example, it's just simply blurring towards the edge. Which, don't get me wrong, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it adds another level of complexity to the mesh, to the material that you're creating. And when you duplicate that up on multiple materials, combining it with this method of blending materials, it just got too complex, especially with materials that required a lot of procedural textures and a lot of modifications to get to where you want. So that's where GGX comes in, and this new workflow that I'm going to be showing you in this lesson. So what we've got here is, this is the new version of the material. You can see it's just a single layer. I've got a reflection, the reflection glossiness, I've got a fall off map to it, but because of the way the microfacet GTR BRDF works, we've got a tail on the specular and reflection highlights. So see here where this highlight pings, we've got this nice long tail. And you can adjust that, so if I go down, that's going to spread that more, and if I go higher, it's going to tighten that more. So depending on the type of material you want, you've got this one simple feature to adjust. Now on top of that, when you combine it with a fall-off map in the reflection glossiness, you get an even better result than the 3 materials being blended in the old way, like you saw in lesson 4, in a single material. You don't need to go in and out, swapping maps, copying, instancing, all that crazy stuff. It's all in one single layer now. So in this lesson, the materials I'm going to be creating will all be utilizing this GGX BRDF, and I'd highly recommend that for every single one of your materials from now on to use this, because Blinn and Ward are just very simply outdated now. Now I'm pretty sure that later in the future, V-Ray will go in and add other BRDFs here that kind of are developed as companies utilize them. This particular version of GGX, I'm pretty sure, comes from Disney paper that they were working with on Frozen. You don't hold me to that, but I'm pretty sure that's where it comes from. So if I just render off this GGX version, I'll compare that to the old one just so you can see the difference. So here you can see, using the GGX BRDF in combination with the fall off, we get this really nice transition from sharp reflections on the edge to blurry on the front. But on top of that, if we go to the specular layer, now the highlight is much more realistic and is much more similar to what's happening in real life. All in a single layer. So I'm just going to bring up the old version and render this off. And as you can see, you're still getting the two different layers happening. You're still blending between the two. I should probably cancel this and just tweak this setting a little bit because it's a little bit off. And in my eyes, this old version used to look a lot better than the original, but when you compare it to the new GGX version, the GGX version is just a little bit more toned back, it's a little bit more simple, but most importantly, you don't have that long render time. So we're going to jump into creating the scene materials now. Just want to apologize for kind of taking a little bit of extra time to explain this, but it's pretty important now because what you need to realize is this basically changes everything. Every single material I created for this course is now pretty much useless because the rendering time is so massive. So you're welcome to go in and add a fall-off map in the glossiness of that material, in all the materials that I created for this course. But I will go through and make a couple of adjustments after the course is finished, just to tie up some loose ends and make sure that everyone's using the latest and greatest materials. So the first material we're going to create is this large-scale polished concrete floor. The reason I'm creating this material is because it was highly requested in the emails, and also because it's another material that demonstrates how reflection glossiness can change based on the viewing angle. Now, on top of that, up until this point in the course, I haven't shown you how to create really large-scale procedurals. It's been more of those kind of small metals and things like that, which, in all fairness, are a lot less complex because you can get away with not being so exact to real-world scale. See, for example, on this concrete floor, we're viewing this from, say, 5 feet away. If you zoomed in here to that very small portion where the shader ball would fit onto, we would need to then go in and add a whole nother further level of detail. So to pull things back out, this lesson's a perfect opportunity for me to show you how to work with procedurals at a large scale and show you the power of them. So as you can see here, the render I've got on the left, it isn't perfectly matched to this image on the right here, but that can be because of a number of things. It can be because the lighting I've got in the scene is set up slightly different, and also because the color of the lights can be a bit different. Just so you're not confused, what I've done there in that fade is transition to a new recording I've done recreating that concrete material. So I want to make a point here in that most of the lessons you kind of see a very easy progression from the starting material. Say, for example, in lesson 4, in both parts, you see me just kind of work through and explain how I'm getting the material to look the way it does. But what you're not seeing behind the scenes is all the trial and error that goes into making sure that those procedurals and that overall look is correctly matched. So my point is that even someone like myself with just tons of experience creating materials over and over, none of this stuff comes easy. And the reason it doesn't come easy is because when you're trying to match things from reality and you're not trying to go straight from your imagination, everything has to be pretty much perfect because the eye is so good at distinguishing if something is, similar to another thing. That's why modeling character heads are so hard, because there's so many minute details. But it's also important to realize in that if you do take a step back after you've finished what you think is your final material, sometimes after a couple of hours, you'll start to see all the problems in things. So taking a look at the reference image here, you can see that as the concrete goes further back, it's kind of behaving a little bit differently in that, it's behaving a little bit differently from what I've explained to you guys in the past in terms of how Fresnel works, in that closer to 90 degrees, we're going to see things become more reflective. However, as I become more experienced, even myself, I'm still learning things as I'm creating these lessons. And one of the things I've noticed in this specific material is that I've used similar BRDF kind of fall off to everything else we've been doing in the course. And if you look at the light reflections, they're stronger at that angle. Whereas now in the reference image, you can see that those highlights kind of dissipate as we get closer. Now, without really understanding the science behind all of this, I can only assume that it's not that the material is getting less reflective, but just that the concrete is structured in a way where that light is getting captured within inside the material and kind of blurring it. Or maybe not even blurring it, but just kind of, it's diffusing that reflection as we get a little bit more angled. So you can see what I've done here is this is the old material. And even though the procedurals are set up pretty correctly, the overall look and feel of the material isn't. So now if I go into the new version, I've made some adjustments and I've learned a couple of things about material creation in doing so. Even though it's taken me a lot longer to get to this point, now I've got a better understanding, and that if I ever needed to create something like this again, I've kind of got a better understanding of the fundamental laws that make up that material. So you can see in the new version, I've gone in, added more detail in the Burcon maps. I've added a couple of extra layers to simulate footprints and things like that, smudges on the floor. But more importantly, I've changed the way the reflection fall-off works so that those lights are dimming from that angle. So it's still not perfect. It's always going to be difficult to procedurally match a textured surface like this where things are pretty specific. But the overall goal is to be able to do it perfectly or as close to in one material. And then, for example, if you ever needed to do any kind of variation on concrete or a similar material, you've got this complex procedural layered system there where you can make some modifications, and that should work in all future projects, knowing that because you've matched it so correctly on this one, it's going to look good pretty much everywhere else. So we'll get into Max now, and I'll just start breaking down kind of what I've done to create this scene. So, firstly, I probably wouldn't go to this much hassle just to recreate a material, in that what I've done is I've gone in and actually hand modeled this scene, and I've also used a camera tool that I showed you in, I think it was lesson 6 with the HDRs, to match the perspective, just so I can get the lights in the same position and get the camera kind of falling off so that when comparing the two, it's as close as possible. Now, on a real live production job, say if I had to recreate this interior scene, this is exactly what I do, but the purpose of this lesson is just to show you how to create materials. So in order to do that as accurately as possible, this is the only way you can do that, because you can sit there as much as you want on the shader ball, like I did in lesson 4, parts 1 and 2. Then you go to, as I'm sure you guys are aware now, you go to transition that from the shader ball to a real live object, and things all of a sudden start to look wrong. Whether that be because the reflection amount's incorrect, or the shader ball's picking up highlights that the object you're creating doesn't pick up, therefore changing the look of the material. So this is just an important part of the lesson to let you guys know that to build up the complexity of how you're creating materials, eventually you're going to need to start implementing them in real world scenarios, which is a lot tougher, and is, in all fairness, is probably the reason why early on in the course I didn't do that, because I wasn't fully confident in myself in terms of my ability to understand kind of how ArcViz guys work to actually recreate large scale surfaces like this. But as you can see, if I go into the material here, Don't worry about this underneath one, that's just a variation. You can see that we're getting all this detail from a single V-Ray material. So if I go back into Photoshop and kind of zoom in here, you'll also notice that inside the render itself, and sorry, I should probably just quickly turn off this grid lines, just give me a sec. You can see that there's even that small scale noise in there, and that's actually coming from within the render. So that was another thing that I did in lesson 10 with the plants. You saw that I added that filtered map to the depth of field. So that's something I'll include in each kind of render now from now on, because if I just go into the reference image here, you can see that we're also getting that kind of splotchy noise, which definitely helps in terms of, you know, giving it that photographic quality. Feel free to take that out, obviously, but in this specific example, I like to keep that stuff in, because where the areas are more blurry, you're getting more of that effect happening. So like every other material I've shown you how to create, you start with the larger properties and then you work your way down to the smaller things, like the kind of little indiscrepancy in the reflection glossiness. So the first thing in matching this material is I'm just going to go in and roughly, just to what I think, drop the diffuse value to, you know, a kind of similar kind of level to what you're seeing here. Then as usual, I'm going to put a fall off map in the reflection, take out the Fresnel. You'll notice in this new version of V-Ray things have just kind of jumbled around a little bit, which is fine. It's actually a little bit more organized now. So in the reflection, now that I've got this map lined up here, I'll go in and do the same thing as always, enable the color map. Because it's a grayscale object, I don't need to add any color to the reflection. So I'm just going to start, and like I said from the very start of the lesson, and this is probably where, in all honesty, I might have been wrong on some materials, not from a scientific point of view, but from a visualizing point of view, in that if you're trying to match the real world, sometimes the scientific approach isn't perfect. So if you remember, I was saying from the very start that the reflection fall off at 90 degrees peaks at 1. However, the way some materials are constructed, even though that might be the case in terms of at a molecular level, on a large scale area, that's not what's happening. Because once again, you can see here, you can actually see it happening. As we go further back, those lights dim. We're actually seeing them more closer up. And at first this was extremely confusing for me, because I wasn't sure, while looking at this reference image, if it was the fact that the lights were potentially dimmer, but then I saw this kind of row of lights down here and thought to myself, well, that can't be the case. It's actually happening as things go into the distance of the material. So then another thing I thought is okay, is it possibly because you're in a white filled room and the reflections are just getting all blurred and jumbled up because it's all kind of one color? And then once again I realized that, well, that wouldn't be the case, because that you might see that reflecting in the walls that way, but these lights are still just as powerful at the back as they are at the front, and therefore you'd expect to see them being reflected more. So I can only assume, and this may change once again in the future, I can't say this with 100% certainty, but I can only assume that that just means that this reflection isn't fading off to 1. So let me just drop the value down here. I'm just going to pull this up. Kind of pull it in like so. As usual, just a reminder, always keep this flat. You know, I've seen some people show me their materials and they've got this type of thing happening, which isn't what the values on the refractive index website show. So it's not a metal and it's not a plastic. However, I'm assuming that the concrete is going to behave in a similar way, at least in terms of the way the reflection's working, to a plastic, in that we're not going to see that little dip there. Okay, now I'm just going to quickly add some glossiness to this material, even though I'm not loading any textures at the moment, and I'll just render this to see where we're at as a very rough starting point. And as you can see, this is where the confusion came in, and this is the type of reflection curve I was using on the original concrete material I posted to Facebook. But if we go back to the reference image, we're not seeing those highlights appear kind of further back there. So it took me quite a long time. It took me a couple of hours of thinking about it before I kind of experimented kind of outside the box trying to solve it. And this is a perfect example of how sometimes you can get so caught up on trying to keep things scientific that you lose the artistic side of things. So what I ended up doing is, to solve this issue, is rather than letting the material fade off to pure white at 90 degrees, I just dropped this down a fair bit. So I say I dropped it down 20%. So now even at 90 degrees, we're not going to see a perfect reflection. So I'm going to make a couple of quick modifications and then I'll render it again. So I'm just going to drop this down kind of 20%. We're a little bit too reflective overall. And I'm also going to make sure that they're at the exact same height. So you can see on the left here it's 0.046 and now on the right it is also. The next thing I want to do is I want to move this kind of fall off a little bit more to the right. And now I'll just render again, and hopefully you can see now that the reflection will start to dim from that angle. And as you can see, the front side of the material is reflecting more, and as we go back, that's kind of dimming off. Now we don't have the reflection glossiness set up perfectly yet also, and the diffuse value is a little bit too high, so that's where I'll go in and just start to play with dropping those values and messing around. Now even though it's early days with this material, you'll see that I'm just constantly kind of tweaking back and forth, and that's a skill set in its own, being able to take a look at the reference image. And I actually worked with a girl recently on work experience, and it kind of reminded me how a lot of people who struggle to match reality, it's not because they don't have a good enough eye to do it, it's because they're trying to do too much from their imagination. And I'd consider myself a person who has a pretty, wild imagination, but out of all the artists I've ever worked with, I found myself spending more time looking at reference images than any of those guys, and that is a huge benefit. It's a huge advantage I've got, because over time, when you stare at images long enough, you start to pick up the little details. There's things I'm seeing in this now that I didn't see for the first kind of 2-3 hours that I was looking at it. So once again, I'm just going to drop the values here, just playing around with them. In the reflection glossiness now, I'm also going to put a fall-off map. Leaving it perpendicular and parallel. Once again, I'm going to keep it to mono because this is a reflection glossiness map. You can't have color in those anyway. And I'm just going to start playing with these values. So now I'm just going to load up a high-res preview of it because you can't really see at this level. And now the next thing I'm going to do is in this material preview, it's a little bit noisy. So just before going in and adjusting that stuff, I'm going to raise the subdivs. Now it's a bit smoother, which can sometimes make the difference in being able to tell how a material is working. And as a starting point, I'll just see how that goes. Now the next thing I want to do is by default, V-Ray is going to continue to set things to use the Blinn BRDF, but I think it's probably a better idea to swap to the Microfacet GTR. So you can see here now that that highlight pings off a lot better. If I just swap back to Blinn, it looks really fake and CG. Now I swap to this one and we get that nice tail happening. So as usual, if that tail's too long, to fix that, I can raise it higher. So as I start to go up, you can go all the way up to 100, I believe, but then things start to crash out. So I'm just going to set things to 3 as a starting point, because concrete's not going to give that appearance of that car paint look where the highlights are blooming and have that halo effect. But I'm still going to use the GTR because now we're similar to the Blinn, but we're actually quite different in terms of how it's going to look once rendered. And now I've changed it from Blinn to the Microfacet GTR. The highlights are spreading a lot nicer, but now all of a sudden, once again, things aren't correct in terms of the material glossiness. So before you go in and try and go too far with matching material, make sure you've got the GGX BRDF loaded. So you can see right now that the highlights are blooming quite a lot. So just to fix that, I'm just going to go up and do a little region render over this area, just to shorten that off a little bit. In fact, I'm going to go up to 4 here. Sorry, it accidentally didn't change. So that bloom is just a little bit smaller. I'm also going to make sure Fix Dark Glossy Edges is on. And now I'm just going to once again play with the reflection glossiness. But you can see what I've got happening here is in the fall off map, we're going from black to white. Now, this material isn't going to have any areas that are perfectly, how can I say, they're not going to be perfectly reflective. It's all, at every point in this material, we're seeing a fair bit of blurriness. Even in the sharpest highlights, they're still quite blurry. So looking at this reference image here, I can look at this and probably say that that's going to be, as in the most glossy part of this material, is going to be about 0.8. So in the white value, I'm going to dip that down. So since swapping to GGX, we're a little bit too sharp on the highlights. So going down to the bottom here in the output controls of this map, I can just start to dip that down and try and get it looking a little bit more. You can see, if we go too far down, it's too blurry everywhere, because now even on the edges we're blurring at 0.8. So that's why I'm just going to kind of pull this up and start to get a rough feel for things. And now I'll re-render. I'm looking a little bit better. But at this point, inside the front part of in the back part of the fall off, the wider areas, it's just a simple color. So at this point, this is where I'd go in and add a composite map, or at the very least, a large-scale Burcon map, which I'd later convert to a composite map. So I'm going to kind of preemptively turn this into a composite map, and then load a Burcon texture inside of this. So this is where I'll just take a step back and go back into Photoshop and try and break down my theory on how to approach creating procedural materials in a real-world sense. So if we go back to this main reference image here, you need to think bigger than the small stuff that's obvious to the eye. You need to realize that on large surfaces in reality, and you can see this, just try it out for yourself. Try and go look at a painted wall, or dip yourself down at a low angle while looking at concrete like this, and you'll see that there's some very large kind of patchy areas, and then over time that kind of in terms of nature, how it works, you'll slowly get smaller and smaller patches. So if we look here, you can see that there's areas that are a little bit black, that are quite big in places. You can see this area here is kind of all spread off. So we need to differentiate the glossiness on large areas like this first, and then work our way down to some of the smaller spotches like this. And then as you get closer, you start doing little tiny details, that make up the inside of the highlights. So inside the Burcon map, the first thing I want to do is make sure that the size is correct. So I'm going to leave things to be black and white, even though we need to adjust those values. I'm going to leave things to be Perlin 3D at the moment. And then for the main fractal, I'm just going to load in the heteroterrain. And that's because it produces a soft kind of blend between the dark and white spots. If you cycle through these different materials, you see there's some where it goes very obviously from dark to white, which for the larger scale procedurals won't work as well. And one of the problems with using procedurals is I don't know if you've recognized it, but a lot of the times you see the different kind of areas of, the less glossy areas and the more glossy areas kind of hit this hard line, and it makes things very obvious. So to get a nice soft kind of blur on the material, you need to go in, and I personally like to use heteroterrain. You can see now that it's a little bit better off. So there's another important mistake I've made here that I wanted to keep in the lesson and make a point out of. And that's the difference between using the output area of the map and the mix curve. So when using reflection glossiness to get that effect we're after of going from blurry to sharp, one of the problems is, and because I've gotten so used to working with the output, is that it's not the same effect. So when using the output, what we're saying is that in both of these maps, the front and the back side raise the value up to be white, which isn't what we want. What I want to do is mix between the black and the white map we've got here. So that's where, when using this new method, we're no longer going to use the output map to define that value. So I'm going to turn that off, and now you can see that we're going back to a simple blend from left to right on those two materials. And inside the mix curve, I'm going to add a point. And now when I bring that up, you can see we've still got the detail from the procedural in the blurriness, but we're not blowing everything out towards white. Now this mix curve area is smaller vertically, so try not to get confused in terms of how high you're going up here. You have to imagine as if this is being compressed a little bit. So I've gone a bit higher there. And now if we look at the material, you can see that there's that blurriness starting to kick in. And now you can see on the overall kind of area here that we're blending now quite nicely, and we're getting a similar effect to what's happening in the reference image. Even though the values are incorrect in terms of how blurry it's meant to be, the scale is looking pretty good with a default value of 25. Now, in all honesty, this scene isn't set up to be real world scale, and I'd highly recommend, if you were working with a scene like this, to do it. I think it's kind of just a little bit off, but I don't actually have the raw data. I think this is about 2 meters high, 2.5 meters high, this wall. So it will vary, but if you do have measurements for the scene you're trying to match, definitely incorporate those in, because when you go to use the scale and the size on the Burcon noise textures, you're going to want to have at least some level of consistency from job to job. Okay, so now that I've seen that render, I'm just going to make a small adjustment to the fall off curve here. And I'm just going to pull this up a little bit higher. So now also in the composite map, we've got the default colors as black and white. Now I actually want to raise that because as you can see here, we don't have that effect happening. This is the very base of the material. So this is the largest scale variation. So I'm going to raise this to about 220, and you can see that's affecting the main highlight. And then on the back side of that mix map, I'm going to drop this down to about 242. I don't want it to be perfectly white. Sorry, and you can see I've accidentally rendered from the wrong view. So I'm just going to re-render. So now as a very basic starting point, we're starting to define the overall glossiness of the material. So at this point, it's too early to tell if that's going to be correct, but I'll just add another layer now because now I'm going to start adding in a smaller version of that same map. So I'm going to copy this map and paste it over the top, and then similar to the way the levels system works inside the fractal itself, I'm going to kind of replicate that effect in the composite map. So I'm going to drop this map down to 50%, and then I'm going to change the scale of this material down to 5. Sometimes it's good to just copy and paste the actual value because you can see here the difference in the color is not subtle enough to see the overall effect of the map. So from the top material to the bottom now, you can see what's happening, but the value is much easier to see when black. But if you accidentally forget and you move on to a different part of the material, you want to make sure you've copy and pasted it like I just did. So I've set this to 5, and now I'm just going to raise this value back up to 220. And even though it's very subtle in here, you can't see it in the naked eye. That's why it's good at this point to once again just render it off and see how it's looking. So while this is rendering, you can see the effect is too subtle to notice. So if that's ever the case and you can't actually tell how it's looking in the render itself, that's where I'll go in and just once again fake the value used and then raise it up a bit later. So I'm going to turn off this base map, and I'm going to drop this value down knowing that it was meant to be 220, and there's a couple of settings we've got here inside the heteroterrain that we can play with. We've got the size of the small detail that's being blended through it, and right now I don't think there's enough detail at 2, so I'm going to raise that to 4. And then we can also change the exponent value of that small scale noise. So I'm going to put this down to 0.45 just to create a little bit more variation. Now I'm going to raise this back up to 220. Actually, I'll go down to 210. Now in this top map, I'm just going to unhide that. And the same thing, I'm going to put this to 4 and 0.4. And I'm also going to raise the levels on this map. So if I go down, just to show you the preview here, I can go up to 4. You can't really see it, but at a large scale, on a large scale test render, we'll be able to notice the difference in that we'll get a little bit more of those smaller details blending in with 4 levels. And I'll just see how this looks. So you can see, even though the values are incorrect in terms of the brightness, the scale is looking pretty good at about 5, but I'll probably go down just a little bit smaller. So now we're trying to replicate the details like this here that are mixing the map. You'll notice now that the highlight isn't just this perfect white streak going up, there's little splotches in it. And mine are a little bit too big at the moment. So I'm just going to go down to 3 and re-render this. And now they're a little bit better in terms of, the size of these splotches. It's going to grab the material again and just bring this value up. to about 215 and see how it looks. And it's quite subtle, but you can actually see in these areas now where we're getting those kind of differentiations in terms of the reflection glossiness. So now we can literally do the exact same thing. I'm going to copy this top map into a new layer. Once again, I'm going to put this at 50% opacity. And now instead of going from 3 to say 0.1, like we did in the massive jump from 25 to 3, now I'm just going to shrink this down a little bit smaller. And you can see now in this preview that it makes quite a massive difference from 3 to 1. I don't need to change any of the settings. I'm pretty happy with how all those are working. And now basically we've just blended through one more level at that small scale. I don't know if you guys can tell on your screen, it's pretty subtle. Let me just copy this value so you can see. Just blending that level in. And now I'll do another test render. And you can see in this preview now that the highlights are starting to create kind of little wavy patterns. And now things are starting to actually look quite good in that the little tiny details are blending in. But the most important thing to realize is that you have to work your way down. You can't expect to get a perfect reflection glossiness map in just one or two simple Burcon textures. It's actually quite a detailed process, but if you work through it in terms of large to small, it's much easier to wrap your head around things. So you need to be able to visually take a look at the reference and imagine how the material will look without the tiny little details and the dirt and the grime being smudged into it. Another important thing to realize about that workflow from going from large to small scale detail is that no surface is perfectly flat. Now, I'm not an architectural visualization artist, but one of the massive mistakes people make is not adding variation in the geometry of the surface to create kind of subtle wobbling. If you take a look at this highlight here, most 3D guys, they'll leave this floor as perfectly flat, and then when you go to see the highlight, it'll just be dead set straight. But if you take a look at this, look what's happening here. This highlight is going from starting out here, and it kind of wobbles off a little bit. And others don't necessarily wobble in that same direction. This one here is wobbling out this way a little bit, same as this one. So that's not because the reflection glossiness so much, that's because the overall surface has imperfections in the way they're laying the concrete down. And I'm talking like very, very subtle here. You know, over the whole floor span, the difference might be, you know, a centimeter max in terms of the highest to lowest point. I can't say for sure because obviously I'm not a, you know, mason or, you know, I don't sit there building buildings, but there is always a subtle kind of wobbling in the surface, which leads me to my next point in the tutorial. Inside the base floor geometry here, I've added a noise, and it's very subtle. You can see I've set it to 0.05, but if I go up on this, I'm actually getting that kind of bending inside the geometry itself. You could do it with a bump map. Feel free to do that by all means. I personally like to do it in geometry simply because I can visually see the scale and I don't have to kind of guess it. Now, another important thing to realize is you will need more geometry for that. So by all means, use a bump if you have to, but just add it. You know, it doesn't even need to be a complex bump. The variation is so subtle that you can simply use, you know, just a noise texture inside the map. But I do have that inside the scene. So when you load this scene, make sure to check out that geometry and, you know, have a play with that. I've adjusted the scale to kind of be what I think it should. You know, if it's too big, then you don't get the right wobbling. So now I've covered all the large scale blurring inside the glossiness map. But now at this point we need to start looking a lot closer to see what else is happening on the material that might not necessarily be creating large wobbles, but more about the small scale details. And this is where we'll need to start making some pretty creative and complex Burcon maps. And this is where I'll show you the power of them. So you can see there's some things you're never going to be able to recreate exactly. Like you can see there's little like hard streaks here. But little things like this, these little dimples and little, ridges inside, like little, random little bumps that are just distorting everything. That's all possible inside procedurals. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a new map and we're going to start from scratch with a new Burcon noise. And I'm going to start, with a rough size. I'll go to 5 just because I already know now how big the value of 1 and 3 are, and I just want to go a little bit bigger on this, and I'll show you why in a second. And that's it. Sorry, it's going to be because we're going to add in a lot more detail inside of here. So I'm going to set the noise type to whirly just to create these kind of chips. And then inside the noise type, you've got a whole bunch of different distance options. So if I cycle through them, you can see all the different little things we've got here. For this particular instance, because we've got, we're going to distort this in a second, but for what I'm after, I'm just going to start with Chebyshev. And actually, you know what? Just to show you guys how these things are affecting the object, what I'll do is I'll just keep this over the top and then do a quick render to show you the size of how this is looking. Actually, I'll just, before I do that, just raise the base value up here. So the great thing about this type of Burcon texture is you do get large areas where the map isn't affecting things at all. Okay, so I'm just going to go down on the color I'm using. And it's also important to realize that inside the noise itself, we can once again add a fractal to that. So if I cycle through them, you can see the different effects we're getting here. So you've got tons of options. If I set this to FBM, this could be a potential use, and in my head I'm constantly analyzing. This is why I'll cycle through every time, because if I see something that could look good at a different area of the texture, or a different area of the surface, I'll keep a mental note of how these things are looking. Because now if I zoom in, you'll notice that using FBM, it has a similar look to how the dark spots are appearing here. And I can very easily kind of steal this map. But for this particular instance, I'm going to use hybrid multifractal and just play with the settings a little bit. All I'm trying to do is just create a little bit of variation. And if I drag the exponent down, that effect gets blended in a lot more. So now I need to add more detail to the overall map. So I'm just going to add more levels in, and you can see the effect that's having. So I'm just going to set this to 5.5. Actually, I'll go up a little bit higher. And I'll set it to 5.6. You can see in the offset, I can change things there. And I can also change the gain. So just playing with things here. And what's happening here is as I'm changing the gain of the material and the offset, things are blowing out. So to fix that, I'm just going to change the height. Now you can see that we're getting a nice kind of level of detail in here, and you'll start to probably be thinking, oh, holy shit, you know, the level of detail inside this Bircon, you didn't even know it was possible. But playing with these values, you can produce some really cool results. Alright, now I'll render this off and just kind of see how this is looking. So there you go, we've got a pretty cool type of fractal happening in there. But one of the main problems with this fractal is that it has that very CGI appearance where everything is roughly the same scale, even though it's kind of distorted. There's no areas that kind of have massive differentiations. We're not getting bits that look streaked, for example. It's all kind of circular and it's all kind of dotty. So to fix that, that's where I'll go in and use distortion. It's also important to realize that this particular map now isn't being blended in with the others. So I will need to go in and change that. But first I just want to get this map set up correctly. So inside the distortion, I'm just going to enable it, and I'm just going to bring in another Bircon noise map. Now, whenever you're using a distortion map, you don't want it to be too small. When you have a smaller map, the detail just becomes so insanely detailed that the render times drop quite a lot. So in this distortion map, I'm going to raise the size to 55, so we're much larger. Once again, I'm going to set it to Wall-E, and I'm going to use, might need to just change the scale of this so I can see the different effects. And I'm just going to use Minkowski 4 because it has a soft transition between the bright and dark values. When you use values that are too small, for example, if I just use this here and show you how the distortion is working, if I just start to increase that, what you'll notice is you get hard, let me just bring this up, you get hard areas that don't make any sense. So you always need a soft transition on your distortion maps. So I can drop that value. And now I'm just going to go even higher here, so I'll just go 3.5. I'm going to add a fractal into that and just play with the different ones, see which looks good. And I'm going to decide to use the FBM turbulence. But generally I'll experiment with, I'll just do test renders on all of them. And I recommend you do the same. So now I'm just playing with the detail. If I drop the exponent down, we get a little bit more detail being blended through here. And I'm just going to raise the levels. So now we've got a freakishly detailed texture map. So now you can see when I use distortion, we're blending in a lot more detail. And I'll just give this a test render. And you can see there's a slight problem with the scale here. I've accidentally left this at 4.4, so I'm going to raise this back up to 55 again. Now if I go back out to the main Bircon map and preview it again, we've got some areas here that kind of have streaks and stuff in them that were missing in this render, so I've got to re-render again. Okay, so you can see it rendering now, and there's areas that kind of have some more interesting shapes. It doesn't look as CGI now because there is areas that actually do stretch and distort. And as we go further back, you can see that it's actually looking quite cool. Now, once again, remember that we haven't blended this through yet. And also, I'm rendering at the moment quite small resolution. So the thing I'll do at this point is, now that it's quite important to be focusing on the small details, I might be missing some things at the resolution that I'd be printing this at. So I'm going to up the resolution. I'm going to go to about 1800 wide this time. And this is where I'll just let it render for a little bit, just so I can see the frame. Then I'm going to turn on region rendering, because I still don't want to have to wait ages to see things done. So I can now just render off a small section and get an idea purely for the feel of the Burcon maps. And there's actually some areas here which I'm not too happy with in terms of how the distortion's working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the map, and in the distortion amount, I'm just going to go to 0.07 and re-render. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this, but like I said, this is being blended in at 100%. We're not seeing any of the work we did earlier. So this is where I'll go in and actually use the mask functionality inside the composite map. And I'm just going to load another Burcon noise map into here. Sorry, I've accidentally loaded the wrong thing. And I'm going to make the size kind of in between what we've been working with so far. So I'm going to set the size to around 12. And I don't want to blend this in at 100%. You can see now that the reflections on the concrete are really quite blurred. And if we look at the reference image, the highlights are much stronger. So we've got too much of this top layer blending through. So I don't want any areas of this to be blended through at 100%. So that's where I'll go in and drop the white height. So now we've got this kind of map here that's, you know, going to slowly blend things in at different points. So the whole idea of removing that tileability in the fractals is you work with different types of fractals and you blend them in at different areas of the floor's surface. So you can see here we've got quite a large scale, and just to enhance how they're coming through there, I'm just going to raise this up a bit so that the dark areas are a little bit stronger. Now next up, it's a little bit too simple at the moment. So even though this fractal doesn't need to be that detailed, because all the detail you can see it's already in here, I'm just going to add, once again, that hetero terrain. I'm going to go back up to 4, just so we, you know, enhance kind of the amount of detail in that map, and then raise the levels up. Now that this map is only going to be blended through in certain areas. So this is where it's quite an important step, because I haven't experimented yet at this stage in blending in maps with opacity. So rather than doing small scale render, you might miss something kind of in the general area. So that's where I'll just do a much larger region render and see how this looks. And as you can tell, the render's happening quite quickly. That's because there's not a lot of AA happening in scene, and I've really significantly reduced the light cache properties. So hopefully what this does is, and you can see it's already starting to happen, we're only blending in that map in small areas. So we've got all this tiny detail getting blended through, just like we're seeing here in the reference image, but it's not happening everywhere. But one thing that's going to be missing now is what do we do about blending in some detail in the areas where we don't have all this detail? Because you have to assume that this floor has been quite used. So even though the type of detailing might differ from place to place, at least every part of this surface is going to have some kind of small scale detail. There's no areas here where it's perfectly clean. You can see wherever I zoom in on every single highlight, there is that kind of smooth banding happening. So this is where I'd go in, and you can see it's actually starting to look pretty good now. We're starting to increase the level of randomization. You can't tell there's any one significant fractal happening, and because we've blended it in a little bit less strongly, we're not noticing that weird pinching effect. You can kind of see it here, but we'll get to fixing that in a second when we blend more detail in. But ultimately, the best part about this is there is bits, like you can see right here, where there's some streaks happening, which people don't commonly associate with fractals or with procedural textures. So I'm going to add another layer now. And the goal is here is to create a map similar to this one, but with totally different settings. So we're trying to create that small scale detail, but just vary it up a little bit. Now, once again, the beautiful thing about working with procedural textures is I can make an entirely different shader and simply from shader to shader copy this entire composite map and then maybe only change a couple of small things. And then you can go from making something like really shiny concrete to blurry concrete just by changing a couple of values. So always remember that you do have the ability to copy this work over, and you don't need to, once you build up a little bit of a library, and that's what I did at Cream, where things like we were actually doing things like this. Even though I wasn't working in ArcViz, there was moments where we had to reutilize large scale shaders that we couldn't work with textures for. And before I finish this shader, I'm going to show you a couple of different methods of enhancing this with real world textures, because sometimes you need to produce effects like cracks around tiles, or you've got bits of grout in here. So I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm going to show you how you can just work with real textures as well as the fractals, just like we did with lesson 4, where I was blending in those smudge maps. So once again, inside this new texture map up the top there, I'm going to load another Birkon noise map. I'm going to make the size fairly small. You can play with this. It's totally up to you. 8 is the value that I settled on. Rather than using Perlin, I'm going to use Simplex just because it's a little bit more choppy. And inside the fractal, I'm going to use a hybrid multifractal. And you can see that's producing a bit of a weird look. So that's where I'll just start playing with the settings to try and fix up this crackling around the edge. And if that doesn't work, you can always cycle through and use different ones. And once it starts to blow out white like that, simply raise the high value to pull this back in. So now you can see where I'm trying to get at here, where we've got some areas that are quite dark and splotchy that are going to blend in nicely and produce areas that are a little less detailed than the areas around them. And you can raise that until they're entirely gone if you want, but I'm just going to leave them there as a little bit small. And then once you've set some different settings up, it can be good to just go in and try out how those settings work with different fractals. But as you can see, the reason why I settled on this is because there are areas that aren't going to, distort the surface too much. So maybe I'll just have one more play, kind of making those areas a little bit bigger. And so actually what I'm going to do here is because this fractal isn't as realistic as the other one, I'm going to steal the mask I used on the previous map and paste that in here. Now I've got to use a different map inside the base material, and I'm going to try and blend that in a little bit smaller scale. So in this base texture here, I'm going to reduce the size of that map. And I'm actually pretty happy with that. That works out quite well. So I can just leave it like that. So now you can see the fractal's got quite a few different areas here. And I'll just do a test render to see how this works. But there is one thing lacking at the moment that I can already see, and that's we don't have areas that are quite dark blended in. So what I mean by that is if we go back in here, there are definitely points where that glossiness and that darkness blends in quite harshly. So before I'll just do a test render there, and then once that test render is finished, I'll add one more layer to this, and then we can finalize, maybe tweak a couple of settings depending on how it looks. And if that's good, then we can start utilizing this reflection glossiness composite map to build up the diffuse texture. Because once again, the reason why these areas are appearing more or less glossy is because the material changes. So these glossy parts, that's most likely dust, and it can be scuffing, but usually when you do get scuffing like that, the reason it appears darker is because dirt has built up in those areas. So we're going to have to associate the same reflection glossiness map with the diffuse map, just like we did in lesson 4. You can see if we swap to the specular pass, the anti-aliasing is a little bit crappy at the moment. So probably if this looks good, I'll add that one last layer, and then I'll start changing the render settings, because what you'll notice is going to happen is that as we introduce more of this small scale detail into the scene, we're going to need more work done there on the anti-aliasing engine to clean up those Burcon textures. The sampling on the material alone isn't going to be enough for that. So that's where I'll also introduce to you a little bit more of that render theory and how I work on a production basis. Because as your job is changing, so are your render settings. Now, you don't need to change those settings every single render, but every few hours, it's always good to reevaluate that type of stuff. Because once again, I've seen guys run through an entire job and never change the render settings, thinking that they're universally going to work at every single point in time, when a lot of the times it changes quite rapidly depending on the texture or shader you apply to your scenes. Okay, so in order to add that final level of detail, I don't actually need to go in and create an entirely new Burcon map. We can actually modify what we've got here, because the texture I've already created is actually quite good. It's got all the detail we need, it's got everything enabled, and once you get a feel for how to play with the Burcon textures, you'll realize it doesn't actually take that much to modify them to make them completely different. So I'd even recommend, as you're creating material libraries, just to sometimes, get a little sphere in the scene, just create a little spherical object, apply a Burcon texture to it, and just save it to a library of Burcon textures. So that way when you load up that sphere and sample the texture from it, you might already have 5 or 6 maps that you can work with. So I'm going to copy this top layer, I'm going to paste it over the top. Now, unlike these other layers where I'm blending it in at different areas, I'm going to blend this in kind of universally across the whole image, except this time we're going to localize those small little dots to only appear in smaller areas on the map itself, which will need adjusting the Burcon map for. So I'm going to swap this to multiply, and you can see the effect this is going to have. It's going to darken everything off. But because I haven't changed the scale, it's just darkening off what we've already got there. So for this top layer, I'm going to set the size to 8 just to vary it a little bit. And then I'm going to drop down on the height in the size, so that what that does is we're only blending in little tiny cracks and things like that. I'm also just going to vary these settings, not so much to produce a different effect on the texture, but just so that it doesn't look like we've copied the same map and overlaid it over the top at a different size. I want to introduce enough variation where you can't tell what's happening. Now I'm going to lift the gain up, and you can see that's just introducing a lot more white into the map, and it's leaving us with only little bits that are blending through. Now once again, the next thing I want to do is I want to darken off the base color so it goes to black, and then that'll give me control. Rather than, the reason why I'm doing that, I'm making that black there is because now I can go out into the overall composite map and change the opacity of the material here, where I've got access to see kind of what's happening. Whereas if I say, for example, finish this job and come back to it in 2-3 months, there's no chance in hell I'm going to be able to remember every single setting inside the material. So rather than having to go in and change it on a per material basis, try and set things up so that they can be modified in a more simple and easy to control way. So any material you're multiplying over the top, make sure it's black and white, and then just change the opacity. You can see here now that we're introducing these little dots, but those little black dots, they're not, perfectly, it's not blurring it, 100%. So that's where you just drop back off on the opacity there. You only want to make it slightly darker than the areas around. So I can probably go to 50% on this. Just going to tweak a couple more settings just to reduce the amount of those little holes. And that should do it. Now we've got a whole bunch of variation in this surface. It's consisting of 7 different layers going from largest to smallest. And at the very top, we're multiplying over the top. So you can see the workflow, adheres to a little bit of common sense. And that way you know that if in the future you come back to this map, you're not having different effects at different levels on the map. You work your way down from largest to smallest, and you're gonna, trust me, you're gonna remember over time exactly what you're doing. It'll take a little bit of practice, but once you get a feel for layering up Burcon maps like this, you'd be extremely surprised about the possibilities. And in the finale lesson, I'm going to show you how you can work with Burcon maps to produce really cool displacement effects, to create rocks and things like that. So we're going to build up a little bit of a scene similar to one of my folio images, and I'm going to try and include as much information as possible in that finale lesson so you can get a true idea of how to work on production jobs. Because everything, even though each lesson is being broken down kind of piece by piece, when it comes to tying in 50 different things you've learned together, then once again it can become a little bit tougher. Kind of similar to, for example, if I'm training boxing in the gym, I learn how to throw 15 different punches. As soon as you've got to throw a combination of those, it becomes exponentially harder for your brain to wrap your head around. So that's why in that finale, you'll be able to see kind of the amount of detail that goes into each job, and also a little bit of a tie-in for the lighting. So I'm going to do one more render here, and like I said, I need to adjust the settings so that I'm seeing things perfectly anti-aliased. So I'm just going to go into the settings here. You can see once again I'm using pretty standard settings. I'm not using the divide shade subdivs off, and the reason I'm not doing that is because a few of you guys sent me emails who are a little bit confused about the workflow, and I think everyone's gotten more used to working with this on, which is completely fine. But for those of you who are joining V-Ray late, I'd probably recommend utilizing the workflow with this turned off, just for simplification. So I'm going to drop down the color threshold to 0.01, and I'm going to raise the max subdivs up to 1 and 12. If we take a look at this latest render, you can see there's nothing happening in terms of, we're only using the minimum anti-aliasing subdivs everywhere except the highlights, which isn't exactly the best way to handle things, because eventually we're going to add in some diffuse textures also. So in these areas where we're getting the reflection blurred, we're still going to see dark spots. So things are looking quite good. But if you remember what I said just a second ago, there is moments where you might need to require actually using some real texture maps. So even though I'm not going to go into it in this lesson, because I think it's pretty self-explanatory in that you don't have to always use composite maps in here. But for example, I can add another, and you can see in Photoshop here, I've just loaded up one of the textures that I've provided in the course, and basically you can see that there's just various effects happening here that are pretty much impossible to achieve in a procedural texture, like the scrapes and the scratches. However, there are going to be moments in the texture where you might want to blend stuff like that in. So once again, what you can do is in the map here, load that texture up, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to preview how this looks. Then I'm going to go to the camera view, and I might want to change the tiling until I get that more correctly. And this is a tileable texture map. And you can see here, one of the problems with using a map like this is, and I'm just going to have to go a little bit more extreme on the tiling, is that we start to see all the repetition in the texture map. So in order to avoid things like that, and actually I need to go quite more low res on that, because if you go too high res, you're going to notice the pixelation in the texture. But I'm going to set this map to multiply, and I'm going to set the opacity to about, actually I'm going to leave the opacity map to 100, and I'm just going to copy and paste the map for the opacity on one of the previous Burcons into this slot. Now I'm going to make the size a little bit bigger here, and I'm also going to only blend it in. I'm going to increase the low level so that it's totally cutting it away in different parts of the surface. The reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to try and avoid seeing this same, not every part of the texture looks repetitive, but you do have some areas of the map that look quite obvious. So to do my best to get rid of that, I'm just going to go